authority. So I'm just going to pound the table. Welcome. It works sometimes. Well, Khrushchev did it. You're right. I'll take my shoe off. Welcome, and thank you all for committing another treasured Saturday morning to do this work. And I'm glad to see you all, and I assume that that Alan will show up. So I'm on a roll with these poems, and I brought this in honor of Betty. This is a Garrison Keillor collection, maybe familiar to some of you. And there's a wonderful poem here titled Sometimes by a poet named Chennault Pugh. Sometimes things don't go, after all, from bad to worse. Some years, muscadel faces down frost, green thrives, the crops don't fail. Sometimes a man aims high, and all goes well. A people sometimes will step back from war, elect an honest man, decide they care enough that they can't leave some stranger poor. Some men become what they were born for. Sometimes our best efforts do not go amiss. Sometimes we do as we meant to. The sun will sometimes melt a field of sorrow that seemed hard frozen. May it happen to you. And now I don't know who's taking over.
That would be me.
Okay.
I'm here. Good morning, everyone. And before I review the agenda, I thought, Councilor Clark, as Councilor President, would you like to make any opening remarks?
Not today.
Not today. Okay. Well, with that, I'm Mia Carriaga with the City Manager's Office, and we will review the agenda for today. Perhaps. Maybe. Okay, we don't need the slide. That's okay. The agenda is right in front of you. And we're here today as part 2 of a 2-part council retreat to help all of you carve out time to think about what you'd like to accomplish over the next 12 to 18 months. Oh, thank you. There we go. So this morning we'll have a brief staff presentation to provide an overview of the topic areas that you highlighted last week, or a couple of weeks ago. And then we'll spend the majority of your time today in small group discussions coming up with outcomes on each of those topics. We'll break and then have a report back to the larger group and start sort of working through what is floating to the top. We don't anticipate that we will leave today with all of the answers, but we're really here to listen today. The executive team is here today to facilitate and listen so that we can come back to you with some outcomes as you work through this information. On February 10th, you'll recall that you spent quite a bit of time in breakout sessions then also, and you were able to work in groups to come up with outcomes that you'd like to achieve over the next 12 to 18 months. That list was quite lengthy, and while we're highlighting 3 areas today, the thing that we really want to emphasize is that, and you have a packet in front of you that helps outline this, it's not that the other things aren't happening or that we won't be doing something with all of those things over the next 12 to 18 months. The 3 that we've highlighted were those that you identified as needing more attention because maybe we don't already have a plan in place or you'd like to spend some time thinking about what success in each of these areas might look like. So many of the items, and John will talk about these in his presentation, that didn't make the short list for today have a plan or you've had ample conversation about recently and you know where you're going. So that's how we arrived at working on these 3 for today. In the small group discussions, we'll be asking that you really think about what the evidence will be that will tell you we're moving forward on the 3 topics of public safety, housing, and homelessness. And so you'll have ample time to discuss in small groups what that looks like. On the back of your agenda, you'll find we're going to play musical chairs a little bit today so that you have time to work with all of your colleagues throughout the day. And we're going to ask that you rotate for each of the topics. And so you'll need to refer to this. It's not as complicated as it looks, but you won't be staying with the same small group for the entire breakout session. Any questions about the agenda before we move to the staff presentation? Councilor Taylor?
I'd like to say something. Since our last meeting, I've had several emails from people who are really concerned that they think we're neglecting climate change. And I would like to say that that's not that we're not neglecting it. I hope it's at the very top of what we're concerned about. And I think the fact that that wasn't listed here doesn't mean that, I think it means we take it for granted that that's what we're doing. Is that correct?
Well, I think John will speak to this, but as I mentioned, so we have the climate recovery ordinance, the CAP and the ICAP, and some clear paths to and policy direction from the council about where we need to be going. And that is why it's not listed on today's agenda for an area of further discussion today, because we've got a clear path about where we're headed. And again, I'll let John speak to that in his presentation.
Because we are working on that, right?
Correct.
Staff is. Thank you.
I agree with Betty. I've also gotten these emails, and I wasn't here, and I see these plans, but I think it's horrific that it's not a tier 1, because if we don't have a clean environment, all of us will be homeless. And I think there's a lot of frustration in the community that at a city level there's things happening, but we're not engaging the public with how they can really contribute. We're riding bikes, we're recycling, but it's not enough. And of course, Eugene cannot solve this global problem, but we need to try. And if we're a model that's copied, we actually could make a difference. So I realize these other things are up in our face, and we certainly need to pay attention to them. But I think we should at least put a number 1 next to climate, even if we're not going to talk about it today. Thanks.
Sure. I'm sorry. Let's go to Councilor Ye, and then we'll come back to the staff presentation.
So I can't remember exactly. I wish I had taken a picture of the little board we drew, but I assume that these top 1s and top 2s are the ones that we all voted for, and those are the 6 that rose to the top.
Yeah. So just to recap how that system worked, each of you broke into small groups and determined which areas of focus you want to look at over the next 12 to 18 months. The top tier represents the most overlap in those discussions. And as I understand, part of those small group discussions did center around what are we already accomplishing? What do we have a sense of what we have a path, when we have a path or an existing plan for something, is that an area that we need to focus on, or do we feel comfortable with where that's headed? And so that's how some of that floated to the top and other pieces didn't. And it doesn't mean that we aren't going to do work on those other things. It simply means that these are the areas where we could use a little fleshing out, the 3 that we're talking about today. So if I may, I'm going to turn it over to John for the staff presentation. Oh, Councilor
I have a comment. I think this tiering is something that the council needs to take up as a question. What it leaves is the impression that these are the ones that are the most important. These are the second most important. These are the third most important. And my impression of what we did last 2 weeks ago wasn't to figure out which ones were the most important, but which ones were the ones that we needed to work on. For instance, I don't think, I'm not sure, but I believe that a lot of councilors didn't think we needed to put climate change on the list because we're doing a lot on climate change. That doesn't make it a tier 3. That makes it maybe a tier 1. It's just that we already have a plan. So the tiering needs to clarification. This leaves the impression that this is the priority of importance, and I don't agree with this tiering for one. So I think we either need to discuss that or change the way that we've organized this.
And we can do that. One of the things that we purposely said is we didn't want to use the term priorities because there wasn't a sense of coming into that meeting or out of that meeting for all the reasons several of you articulated, that it sends an unintended message that these things aren't a priority. And so I do think and we can change it however we want to do that, but I think you're exactly right. The intent was there are some areas which really, when we think about focus, really could use, I think, some additional council policy focus and direction on some of these areas because for whatever, housing is a great example of that we'll eventually talk about. A lot of conversation in the community. I know many of you attended the workshop a couple days ago, which having gotten a briefing on that, sounded like it was an excellent sort of work on that. So there's a lot of energy around that, and it's probably an area that, from a staff perspective, also could be from a community perspective, that it would be very helpful for council to continue to give some really good policy direction on something like housing. So I would agree with you. It's not that these aren't as important. They just don't need as much effort at the moment from a council perspective to kind of keep us moving forward. That's really more of the intent on some of those. So we can change the nomenclature.
Tier to me means priority.
Yeah,
So
we can
maybe
change all
if we
that.
redefine tier that says the areas that need the most work on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can change that, and it also will. It doesn't mean those are the only things that will be worked on, for sure. All these other things will keep moving forward as things need to work their way through. So we'll be happy to change whatever words make some sense.
Right, because I agree. There's, City Hall has got lots of stuff going on. We don't need to do much about that. Parks and Rec is going to either die or live on the ballot. Climate Change has got the CF going. We're just about to hire somebody. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but the other things don't have a lot of direction. So if we're redefining tiering as things that we need to put the most clarity to, as opposed to priority to.
Just need a little bit of focus from the council to sort of put those areas in the same place as some of these other areas already exist. That was Greg and then Chris.
I just think eliminate the column. Just eliminate the column. Calm down, Alan. We just eliminate the column. I think all of these issues are priority for council. There are other issues that didn't make the list that are not that are priorities to some of us individually as well as collectively. But as far as the top 10 or however we got on here, they're all of a high priority. I don't think that we should be in the business of ranking anything. So let's just address what needs to have the most attention at this time now versus what we've already got in the hopper and moving, because we've got a lot of stuff going on with climate, but there's other issues like housing that's really more challenging, well, not more challenging, but as challenging, but, requires some attention that we don't have focused on that at this particular time.
Interestingly, this is a debate that's been going on since even before I got on the council, was how do we rank things so they don't get ranked? How do we indicate importance so we don't indicate importance? How do we ensure that a topic that has a substantial constituency in the community doesn't feel like they've been wronged or ignored? And the council's gone through this process in the past and never been able to come up with a satisfactory way to not make people feel like they're being shrifted or diminished somehow. And I don't think that's our intention, and there is no word you can come up with that's going to be satisfactory, because somebody's going to feel like they're not being given as much attention as someone else. And so I think Alan kind of hit on what's important to me, which is there's a number of topics here that are important, and we have a fair amount of clarity and certainty around. We know where we are going. But there's other issues where there's a great lack of clarity. And the three that are listed here, housing, homelessness, and public safety, at least for me, are three topics where we don't have a lot of clarity. We also don't have a lot of certainty of what comprehensively. We have little bits and pieces. To me, I think spending some time to say, let's build some clarity around these issues so they can be as clear as some of the ones that are here too. But to me, they're ones that I see more clarity around. We've had committees, we've had reports, we have a direction. We know where we want to go. We put something on the ballot, we've created an ordinance, we're moving in that direction. These first three, we don't have, to me, a lot of clarity around. So for me, these three are actually the ones that we're specifically saying, let's spend some time to create more clarity and some more certainty around. Not that they're more important, they just need some of our time to be more clear about.
Mayor, do you want me to call them folks, or do you want to do it? Or
I don't know. I sort of lost track of who was running this.
Okay,
meeting.
so
Betty's
who?
in here, then I know.
Great. So
Greg is
we'll do
back.
Betty and Greg, and then I'll take over
Spend all
this
day
role.
talking about what we should do.
Right.
But I didn't like the groups. I thought what came out of the groups was what the most dominant person in the group wanted to come out. And I didn't think that we did any serious thinking about what we were talking about. It was more like more like a party game. Rank something and say what you want, and then say what you want, and then vote on it. But it was not. I don't think we did serious thinking about things. And if we're going to say, I think a lot of people in the community got really alarmed that they heard that we were talking about things and not talking about climate change, which of course is the most important of all. Thank you.
Okay. Greg?
Oh, I just wanted to maybe frame this in a little bit different way. It's similar to what Chris was talking about. I look at this as, I look at my children. I love all of my children, but some of my children need more attention than others. And depending on the time and who's having more issues, those are the ones that are going to get more of my attention. I still love the other ones, but, you know how that works.
We should end on that.
We should. I think that dials it in.
Yeah.
So I think now we are ready to turn this over to the manager.
So with that,
Thanks, Dad.
what I really want to do is just sort of orient you a little bit to what you have in front of you, so everybody kind of gets a sense of some things. So there is this matrix now that no longer has the column in it, the word that will not be shared anymore in it. And part of what the purpose of this is just to give you a quick recap of where we are on a variety of things. I'll come back to the three of them in a moment, but for example, City Hall was talked about. You've taken recent action on City Hall. Things are moving forward as per your guidance, and there will come a time on or before December 1st where we will come back and have another conversation around what you choose to do with City Hall. So there's really nothing else at the moment that you need to provide guidance on. Parks and Rec was one item that you talked about. Again, you provided direction already. You referred something to the ballot. And one of the conversations that you have indicated into the future you want to talk about is a sustainable funding source for operations and maintenance. And from a staff perspective, we prefer not to have really any conversations around this topic as something's moving towards the ballot. It just makes it really awkward for us. And so that would be a piece that we would prefer not to have any more conversation about, at least until after the May election. Economic growth and stability, what you have in towards the back of this package, you might remember several years ago the council at the time approved this baker's dozen of economic development items. And very last handout, I'll just kind of refer you to that and talk just very briefly about a couple of things that were on this particular item, and if people have more questions, me and others can refer to them. But for example, things that were on there, investing in the Manufacturing Communities Partnership, that was that program that was developed under the previous administration, President Obama's administration. There's still work going on in that sort of ebbs and flows, and that'll be one that we continue to monitor as much as anything, but there is a lot of work still, or energy around cross-laminated timber and the use of that, so that hasn't gone away. 2021 World Championships, a couple of months ago, Sarah provided an update on that, and so there are things that are continuing to move forward on that, and within this, our organization and trying to take a look at what the projects we want to do moving forward with that, and we can talk more about that. Rain, we probably won't talk a lot about at the moment, but that is one of those important economic development pieces that there's a need to continue to work with our partners on sustainable funding into the future for that. And so we're a part of a broader coalition on that. And as we get more information, we can bring that back. E-Web redevelopment, you're very familiar with that. Whoa.
Holy chairs.
Lost my chair.
Well, at least you weren't the chairman.
No, at least I'm not the chairman. That's right.
Bravo.
Very graceful. Did that very, very carefully.
Lost it.
That had nothing to do
You're
with
the only
E-Web.
one.
Chair tried to escape.
And my daughter's looking somewhere on TV laughing.
All of them. Great.
Perhaps one that needs more focus. The E-Web redevelopment, you're very familiar with that just very recently, and we'll be coming back and sometime in the not too distant future to have a continued conversation around deal points that you can consider for that. And so as we kind of go through these, we've tried to provide a little bit of an update around expansion areas based on urban growth boundary. We're in the process of starting some of that work. Sustainable funding for Parks and Rec, we just talked about that a little bit. Investment in creative utilities, high-speed network, you're very much familiar with how that's moving along, extremely positive. LTD and others continue with their moving ahead project. I don't think there's anything anticipated until towards the end of this year. Targeted industries has been a lot of activity. Of course, what we are most familiar with is the tech industry, and Matt Sayer and the Technology Association of Oregon have done a lot of things. The food and beverage industry has sort of convened in a similar way and have hired a similar director. Denny, you might remember the person's name, Micah.
Micah, yes.
I can't remember, but he has the same kind of energy as Matt in trying to convene that food and beverage industry. And then there's another group, I think the Wood Products Group, that's starting to
is moving forward
as a cluster as well. And so we play parts in that in a variety of ways. And then, of course, urban reserves. We've hired somebody on staff to focus on the urban reserves. And so what you said is 2 years after the UGB was acknowledged, which was acknowledged very recently. So we're moving forward on that. So all of those are moving forward in really good ways. Back to the matrix now. The CRO, climate and resilience. Several of you have already talked about a variety of things that are moving forward on that in the CAP and other places, and we'd be happy to talk more about that.
And there's a page in the packet, too.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. So in your package, there's also
The last page, John.
The fact that
On the
last
back,
doesn't
yeah.
tend to mean anything.
It's the first page if you read it backwards.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Thank you. So there's
Stapling's wrong.
The child is doing well.
so there's many things moving forward on that, and of course we can talk about that in detail. New revenue sources. There's been any number of conversations over the years, particularly in the budget committees and reports that have been set out about that, and we have links to a variety of those things. And so any and all of those particular topics we're also able to talk about, but I think we want to spend more time on housing, homelessness, and public safety. And the good news around that is you've also had some information pretty recently around that. And so public safety is a good example of that. Had a couple of work sessions in the last 2 weeks, both on the community justice system, and then Joe provided an update last week on the emergency management system. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here. I can have some more conversation in the smaller groups, unless when I finish up, if you have some general questions about that, we sure can. On housing, we have a work session on Monday, so it's a great timing for that. And don't want to spend a lot of time here talking about part of that issue. I think many of you attended that session, as mentioned last week, and it feels like they did a really nice job of outlining sort of the need around some of these housing issues and connecting into the affordability pieces, at least some of their overall data. I don't think there's agreement on what we do about that as a community, but I do think there's some sense of that, some of the concerns with affordability. And part of what we know just from our Envision Eugene conversation that I think they also emphasize is that there's a significant portion of our community, upwards of 50%, that are housing burdened, meaning that they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. I thought there was a couple of other interesting pieces of data that they did use at that forum. One is the United Way's ALICE data, the Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. Essentially what that says is that although you may be above the poverty rate as set out by the federal government, there's actually a financial instability piece where it's very difficult for families to actually afford their month-to-month expenses and have anything left over to do something with if they have a significant issue. And that for our community is around 42%. And so that's a significant piece, and housing is a large component of that. The other piece that I thought was really interesting, if you look at the details of that, child care is actually the highest cost for people on these in this ALICE place. So there's lots of work around housing, and it might be as we get into small groups that those that attended that forum kind of share some of your perspectives with the rest of us, so that would be great. And then homelessness, what we've included in that is a copy of what Reagan had put together relatively recently, which is really this addressing homelessness brochure pamphlet, which actually is very comprehensive of the kinds of things that we've been engaged in. And I don't think we need to recap sort of the concerns around homelessness. There isn't a magic answer to solve all of it, and it's there's many people in the community that are continuing to do a variety of things, and so we can talk about any of the individual items that you'd like to large group or in the small groups. That's the sort of the basic overview. If there's some questions that people have for the larger group.
Anybody need to be in the queue for comments or questions? Okay. We're good.
So our next item is to move into the small group discussions around each of these topics, and we're going to start with public safety. And if you recall, on the 10th, we talked a lot about crock pot and everything that was in the crock pot on any one of these items that's sort of percolating and cooking. And so today we want you to think about, as you move into your small groups, what the evidence around public safety would be if you were on the path to success. What would the evidence be? And so if we go back to that cooking analogy, it's really, what do you want on the menu for public safety? And, staff can take that and we'll go away and think about the ingredients and how to cook it. But we really want you to focus today on what is the evidence, what are those menu items that you want to see that would help indicate that we're on the right track. So each of the execs will be at 3 of these small groups to facilitate your conversation. Again, if you want to refer back to the key on the back, that will help you know where to go in this first round. And we will spend about 30 minutes on this topic in small groups, and then we'll move on to the next.
Any particular sites for each of the groups?
No. Just find your execs. So, for example, Councilors Evans, Zelinka, and Taylor will find Catherine and Sarah for this first discussion.
Gonna go over here.
We'll be right here.
Councilors Clark, Simple, and Surratt will be with Sue, Christie, and Joe.
We'll go there.
And Mayor, Councilors Ye and Pryor will be with Denny and Renee.
We'll go over there.
Over here. to capture everything that you talked about, because certainly I'm sure you had some pretty in-depth discussions in some areas and not as much in others. But we want to hear the highlights of the outcomes that you discussed, and we'll capture those here. And then in addition, we will check back with the execs to capture everything that you talked about in your small group. So
In no particular priority order.
in no particular order. And so I'll actually just ask for a volunteer.
There's a theme to this
First,
meeting.
and I'll be capturing that up here. Oh, Denny and I made eye contact, so thank you.
Okay, I'll start. I had the mayor and Councilor Jay and Pryor in our group, along with Renee. So I think the overall theme was visible signs of safety and security. And we talked a lot about actual safety versus perceived, and the sense in our group was a lot of this has to do with perceptions of safety, because I think generally we have a pretty safe city. We don't have a lot of bad, violent crime. So a lot of it has to do with how we deal with the perceptions. So some of the visible signs would be that people want to come downtown and have reasons to come downtown and feel safe coming downtown. It's not limited to downtown, but that was used as an example. If people had a feeling that we were actually taking care of things, and there was concern is if there's a lot of visible signs that Eugene isn't safe, it sends a message that we don't care. So the sign would be that there's evidence that we actually care and we're taking care of those things. Matching really the right sources to the right problem, and that was kind of characterized as right sizing the problem. We're never going to get rid of all the problems, but if some of the problems are more right sized by matching resources to the right problem, there would be evidence that we would be making progress. Fewer complaints from community members in neighborhoods would be a visible sign. Less transient populations living on the streets. The public safety presence is actually visible. People feel safe when we have a visible public safety. And that the public safety, the presence is not just present, is that there's actually visible signs that we're intervening in a human way when necessary, and also enforcing when there's actually real crime going on as well. There'd be evidence if police have more time to deal with serious crimes and not spend so much time on issues that are more social service oriented. More positive storytelling, and there's a sense that we could do that, but the best storytelling maybe comes from the community members that actually tell great stories about their experiences out in the community. Chronically homeless clearly have access to the services that they need. That would be a sign of success. People feel more safe on the streets and in their transportation options, meaning they feel more safe driving, biking, busing, walking, all of those things together. And then finally, that we have a clear menu of response options, and they're all measurable, so we can clearly define what's our response for homelessness, for example, what's our response to crime, what's our response to mental health issues, and that we can actually organize those more clearly and measure those more clearly. And then I would ask if anyone else wants to add to that. Go ahead.
One element I would add is we also talked about having a public safety response that didn't always depend on sworn officers, that you can utilize sworn officers when you need them for that situation, but that you have other kinds of security responses that you can use, not only downtown, but also throughout the whole community.
So Catherine and I were with Councilors Taylor, Evans, and Zelenka. And I would characterize there was kind of three categories generally. There was things that I felt like you needed to know that were more data level, and then there were some things you want to see or hear, and then some things we need to do to get there. So in the kind of categories, very similar around the data, that we actually want to know that property and personal crimes are trending down, that we're having less turnover in the community, in the communications center, and that our call times are decreasing or staying where they need to be. There's kind of this long-term stability and growth of police and fire. Like there's a trend line as the community grows that we need to be growing that. That leads to something in the do category, which is you'll feel evidence at the end of the year that you have identified revenue strategies to support that stability and growth. You want to, there was a discussion about, this kind of gets into the knowing and creating, reinstating the community survey, and in that you would be asking questions about, do people feel safe in their parks, you know, downtown neighborhoods, homes. One of the first things that came up in one of the first outcomes that came out is that a police officer on the beat says things are going well, which was really around, and I think around the kind of what you're hearing and seeing, that you're seeing police officers at neighborhood meetings and in the grocery store. I don't know if that's part of the community survey piece, but you're seeing them and that they're saying things are going well. That there's that we're measuring and reporting out on what the impacts and results are of some of the alternative sentencing. There was a whole thing around like wanting to see that we're doing more public education around prevention and more outreach around that. So you want to see that, but you also want to know what the impact's like. Is that actually resulting in things that are going down? We talked a lot about not wanting to see so many deserted houses and some of the other livability issues that are health and safety related. So the whole conversation around rats, things strewn around people's yards that could be a fire hazard or a health hazard. So they kind of cross that line. Let me just make sure. Catherine, do you have anything that I missed here? Yeah. No. Okay. Or anybody? Were you just swallowing something?
No, he's talking in my ear.
Oh, I'm saving the Elvis thing for later. I think that's, is there anything that I missed in that?
Yes, go to the bathroom.
Well, we're saving that for later.
But the turkey poo?
Yeah, well, rats, turkeys, couches, bears. Yeah.
It's an interesting trio.
Yeah. I think that's kind of generally it.
Yeah, we had Councilors Clark, Zimpel, and Syret, and it was Sue, Christie, and myself. And painting in broad strokes, and I tried to combine some of the elements, and I did hear some of them mentioned, is we heard that the interest in regional overall coordination between law enforcement, the judicial system, the prosecutors in the jail beds and the mental health, and finding ways to leverage capacity within the community by working together with those that are having similar customers and have similar regional interests on that.
Nice summary of a complex conversation.
We had a long list of specifics too, by the way.
We're painting broad strokes. We want to see a decrease in quality of life crimes. Measurable decrease. And the next one was captured in a couple different ways, but an increase in 911 center capacity that puts them on par with a national level of service. And the next two definitely go together. It was a combination of 4-minute or rapid response for police officers and having capacity so that 30 to 40% of the time they're not already assigned to a call, given the opportunity to do self-initiated work.
Unallocated time.
A robust community court and the pieces that connect that to social services. And similar to the park ambassadors and even like with the concept of the red caps, a public safety staffing that supports police but may not be sworn police officers. More police officers in general over the next 18 months, knowing the time that it takes to recruit, hire, train, and get on the street. More jail beds that are consistent with the Western United States capacity needs. And we think one of the things that kind of ties a lot of these quality of life and other crimes together were focus on the meth, heroin, and opioids within the community to reduce that part of the cycle of crime and mental health and need for jail and rehab.
We had long lists.
And we want to be happy with the new police chief. I don't want to forget.
Me too.
Yeah.
Joe, I think what I would add to that was we were having an interesting conversation about the difference between outcomes and tactics. And I don't think we solved that one, but we kind of had a mix in our group of those items.
You had one on the top there that was interesting about marginalized communities feel unafraid, or unafraid, or something like that. I thought.
Yes, and that was so that, and maybe the counselor that recommended it would like to jump in, but so that people of color or of social challenges do not feel afraid when they come across law enforcement and they see it as a connection to the community rather than just an enforcement piece of it.
Changing the relationships.
To a community policing relationship.
And I would add the theme of framed community, that the community has a tangible sense of a community policing framework, which the faster response time and less and more time that's that officers are able to self-initiate kind of feed into that. And then I had said an outcome would be increased public confidence and that they will get a response if they call for service.
Okay, so if you look through these, a couple of things that I heard right off the top were confidence is definitely something, both community confidence and then confidence from police staff, so that when they are, if something to them, they can say with confidence that things are going well. I think response times and shorter response times was a continued theme. Data that supports all of these things, so reducing crime, crime prevention, that was certainly an ongoing theme. Some interest in listening to the community around this topic. One of the groups brought that up.
Can I ask about that, Mia? So when it was reported, I think Sarah said restarting the community survey, and I can't remember when we had a community survey. Can someone speak to the history there?
You might know the specifics of the date, but it seemed like somewhere around 2010 was our last one, and I think we used to do it every couple of years. And as part of the just basic budget reductions and things we were doing, I think we felt like at the time, what I remember is that we were doing so much community outreach around Envision Eugene and some of the other places that we felt like that was someplace we could hold savings for a little bit of time. But I think some of the conversation has been it would be useful to go back out with that and maybe a refreshed way.
Because that was a question I had as we were in our small group, like how can we measure some of these things? But I didn't ask the question, so I'm glad that it's been put on.
We used to measure it on a regular basis. Do you feel safe
Right.
kind of question.
So you could see over time.
Yeah, right. It has to be over time. Trend it.
So a lot of these things also sort of spoke to this idea of community policing, which I think aligns with the presentation you all received about 21st century policing a few months ago, and something that's a focus for the new police chief recruitment. And I think those are just off the top and at first glance, the commonalities that I see here. Is there anything anyone else wanted to?
I think that all three groups actually talked about staffing and a diversity of staffing, public safety staffing that would support the police but not necessarily be uniformed officers.
And Mia, that wasn't a happy new police chief. It was happy with the
We also want to happy.
Gary's happy. Or she's happy.
No, that's why I was laughing, because we have more detectives for opioids. It was actually said more detectives, on.
More detectives on drugs.
Yeah, there's something that popped in, a couple of things that popped in my mind on this that we don't have up here. One is diversifying our police force and our fire department, and increasing our recruitment and retention efforts for particularly police officers and firefighters of color, and also into the court system as well. And then, I was thinking about the survey, and I'm thinking that maybe we need to do something more comprehensive in an institutionalized way, that we don't do something every couple of years, that maybe we do it every 3 or 5 years, and we do a broader kind of look at kind of a horizontal slice of the community. And I'm thinking that we do the three prongs of social, service kinds of protocols, that we do a survey, we do focus groups, and we do individual interviews, and collect a more comprehensive snapshot of, what people are thinking. And then we can do that in 3 or 5 year increments, to where, we have a really comprehensive look. And then we can come back and say in 3 years, okay, what's different now than what we had 3 years ago? Or what's different now than what we did 5 years ago? What are the changes and perceptions of the community about, public safety, and how the quality of life is for the community at this point in time? And really have kind of that 360-degree look at it. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is more of a 360-degree kind of look at what our public safety profile is, comparison to what the perceptions of the community are, and to what we are doing to address those perceptions.
Mike?
We also had,
Because they're, sorry.
we also had more prosecutors to take care of the crimes, because one of the reasons we're not arresting is because we can't do anything about it.
Thank you. We're talking about a lot of issues around this. We're putting a lot of things on that paper. We glossed over some that, for me, are much more important. I guess I'd want to say more directly that when I said 4-minute police response and 30 to 40% unallocated time for officers, those are very specific outcomes, but you could talk for an hour about why. And so I don't want those to get lost in the shuffle, because in order to get that done, the real point is we need, as we learned the other day, to have a dramatic increase in sworn officers. And I just don't want to see us not really focus on what we heard the other day, and that as an outcome.
Can you say it one more time?
30 to 40% unallocated time for sworn officers. In other words, they're self-directing their own activities rather than simply responding to calls. It gives two things. It gives a greater sense of community policing, and it prevents more crime.
Councilor Zelinka?
One thing to add to the community survey was one of the key indicators of success is if people perceive they're safe, and safe at different kind of levels. So safe generally, safe downtown, safe in your parks, safe in your neighborhood, safe in your house. So it's all that gradient of places that you need to feel safe. And we used to get at some of that in the survey back in the day.
Next question could be, have you ever been diagnosed with paranoia?
Yeah, that would be a qualifying question.
Why do you want to know that?
Hey, look, just because I might be paranoid doesn't mean people aren't after me.
So on that note, I think we're going to move to our next topic.
And how much time do you spend in the bathroom?
So
Needs explaining.
the next topic that you all will discuss in your small groups is housing. And let me just rattle off you the places where you're each going to go. So Councilors Clark, Yeh, and Semple, you'll be with Sarah and Catherine. Councilors Taylor, Pryor, and Vinnis, you want to find Sue, Christy, and Joe. And Surratt, Zelinka, Evans, you want to find Denny and Renee. Okay, and we'll take 30 minutes for this next round.
We're informal. But our group.
right away up there.
And in the interest of time and getting you out of here on time today, we want to keep moving while you continue to eat. So we're back for the report out on your discussions around housing. And Chief has volunteered to go first. Oh, I'm sorry, Sue. Sue volunteered to go first.
Call me Chief.
Yes.
Chief for you. So the mayor, Councilor Taylor, and Councilor Pryor were in our group with Christy, Joe, and me. And we tried to group things in topic areas. First is to identify barriers to affordable housing and focus on the short term. So what are the barriers? So we could identify that in the short term, and then we could start working on them. And we identified a few potential barriers: financing, code and permit restrictions, neighborhood concerns, land availability, revenue sources, SDCs, and intergovernmental partnerships, and making sure we align our goals with our other partners in the region. So that was one. Get a comprehensive understanding of what we currently do and how effective those strategies are. Also develop some metrics, and then look to the future to see if those effective strategies can be sustained in some way. That goes back, I think, to some of our barriers of financing and so forth. We talked about a bunch of things related to eWeb, and I think we got to saying the outcome in the short term, the next year or so, would be to have a full briefing with eWeb about their policies, their costs, their weatherization programs, their programs around low income, helping folks with low incomes, and see how that relates to housing affordability and climate change and housing weatherization impacts and so forth. So a full briefing from eWeb would be that topic. We talked about our structure for a housing committee, so rethinking how that's working, who should be involved, making sure that we're inclusive with more types of groups when we have that housing committee. Let's see. Oh, types of housing. So we had one category around types of housing and making sure that we had the right types of housing in the right places for the capacity, and how we can coordinate somebody moving from one type of a housing opportunity to another. So somebody who's maybe couch surfing but can't afford first and last for an apartment, or somebody who's renting an apartment but can't afford a down payment for a house. So how do we coordinate folks being able to move from level to level? How do we take where we might have a surplus of one kind of housing or a deficit of another kind of housing and use what we already have to create something that matches better with what the need is at that time? Opportunities for chronically homeless folks, including some kind of supportive housing. And so there was a lot in that category, I will say. And then the final thing, I think, which ties to several of these different conversations that we had, was really around thinking about the future and planning 50 years out, thinking about population changes, demographic changes, climate effects, and how the community grows and develops, and being deliberate about how we think about making sure we have the right housing in the right places at the right time for the population that we have and the environment that we're in. Did I miss anything important?
Okay. Thank you. Catherine?
I can run it.
Okay.
So Sarah and I had counselors Clark, Semple, and Ye. And I think our conversation can be kind of broadly categorized into 3 different categories: process, information, and outcomes. So starting with process, and it was one of the first things that came up, which was having these discussions around housing, have the various different groups working together collaboratively. That was important to everybody, and that some of the specifics of that was different for certain folks, but having everybody that's a part of that with the diverse conversation get to walk away with a win. So maybe not one group is unbelievably happy and you have another group that's unhappy, but actually try to have solutions through these collaborative discussions where everybody is somewhat happy, which also means that you are giving voice and outcomes to a minority voice that's a part of those discussions, and not have the outcomes entirely weighted in one way. So that was part of the process piece. For the information piece, there was a lot of discussion around needing to know what council decisions are having an impact on the housing costs. So there are discrete council decisions that go on, but when you take them collectively, what does that mean for the price of dirt or the price to build the house? And that can be manifested, I heard Sue mention, so in SDCs, in permit costs, in all of the various things that can go into that. So getting that information so that the decisions are informed. And then another piece along the information would be, what are the council's goals and policies matching the community's needs? So what are the community's needs? Do they want to have more diverse housing, or are they looking for more housing in one way? And is the council acting in a way that actually furthers the community's goals and needs? And along those lines, trying to do that, having the information that we need to make balanced decisions, which goes back to the process piece, where you're not only making decisions that have positive impacts on one group, but to get the information so you can make broader positive impacts. Let's see. And along the information piece was, well, and I guess this would be an outcome. So let's move on to the third category. So we did process, information, and outcomes. The outcomes, it touched on some things that may fall into the other 2 categories, but one of the outcomes would be having more affordable housing, having more housing stock available. I mean, something as clear as that. Having the percentage of homeowners increase. That's a specific outcome, having that balance between owners versus renters, have ownership go up. Having the unit need and the housing, the number of people that are housing burdened go down. These are specific measurable outcomes that people want to see. Having a multi-pronged approach, that is coming up with a cadre of different tools within our toolbox and being able to select them from them depending on the unique neighborhood needs, right? I mean, that was recognized within our group very clearly. Like, it's not, don't have a cookie cutter answer that would apply citywide, because we have unique needs based on the neighborhoods. So having a toolbox full of tools that can be used and chosen from depending on the needs of that specific neighborhood. That's what I have. Anybody in my group want to
touch on the comparables piece at all? Because I think there was a discussion about one of the things that would be evidence is looking at how Eugene compares in certain areas. Like, what is our wanting to be able to see that our growth rate and population is comparable to our outlining communities. Wanting to know that maybe some of our costs are comparable to similar sized cities. There was this whole area of how we kind of compare as a way to measure.
Yes, and along those lines, another measurement was that this growth within our city is actually on par or as our outlining committee, our city. So Veneta, and it would show, because what the discussion was around is it's becoming more affordable to build a house in an outlying community, but work within the city of Eugene. So to try one of the measurements and would be actually that our population is on par with growth of these outlining ones, which would prove that it's not cheaper to live outside, work inside.
We also talked about the future a little bit there at the end, right? Being prepared for tomorrow's housing types and disruption of technology's effects on how we live.
Anything else that group would like to add? Okay.
Mia,
Okay.
I'm next. Denny and I were with a group of counselors, Evans, Zelenka, and Syrette, and we started with evidence that the housing's on the right track, so the outcomes we're looking for. One is that we had a dedicated FTE to preservation and creation of more affordable housing. Our stock of
Specifically, not necessarily publicly subsidized, but housing that's affordable for.
Yeah. Good clarification. Our stock of housing that is attainable for low income is sufficient to meet our needs. Mix of housing and range of housing needs, we have a broad array. The missing middle housing is addressed. We have a reduction in the number of Eugene households in housing burden. Household income increases. Affordable housing options are increased. And we match outcomes with incentives that are provided for the housing needs. We also, and I'll go back and forth maybe from some tactics to some outcomes. We got our conversation was really good. So it went, all around the topic. So we did talk about the need to increase partnerships to get people in housing that isn't reliant on federal funding. And in true Bob Chadwick form of repeating back people's words, we have a draconian crap going on federally that's affecting us. So we need to strategically work closer with our partners and increase the number of partnerships so that we can address issues at the state level, but bringing more people together to influence some of that allow us to address some of the funding issues that we're maybe no longer getting access to around housing. Let's see here. We talked a little bit about gentrification and what that looks like. And one of the measurements are rents going up disproportionately to the rest of the community. So you're looking at neighborhoods compared to other neighborhoods within a community. We look at demographic statistics to help determine trends in housing. We talked about ripple effects, in particular around gentrification, the concerns of development, and I'll use the example of the OB development, the riverfront development, and then the potential impacts it has on Whitaker and driving costs of housing. We talked about making sure that we understand what we're doing, and we identify what do we know, and then also what are we going to do. And there's kind of three areas of things that seem to stand out. We think that the community is actually educated on the fact that there's a housing burden. because when they go to rent and they go to buy, they see what that is and how it affects them. Let's see, we have this dissonance of this message about we don't have enough supply, yet we say we have a 20-year supply. How do we make that connection? And how do we understand why developers aren't building on available land? Identify the kind of housing that we need is something that we talked about. And how do we support redevelopment of affordable housing without gentrifying? There's, in the whole ripple effect conversation around gentrification, there's also the ripple effect that was felt in development of student housing. Significant student housing that has been built recently is actually feels like freeing up family housing. So it's having this positive effect that's making more housing available. So that's a different type of ripple effect. And then what we thought we needed to focus on was how we use our code to facilitate housing mix that we desire around policy, code, and incentive. And then Alan shared that he was on Zillow, and there's a really cool tool where you can look at anywhere in the city and see what the housing costs are. So check that out. So did I miss anything? I'm sure I did. Alan?
Just reemphasize the metric of just more missing middle housing, more affordable housing.
It was clear. Any other? Denny? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. It seemed like all of the groups were having a hard time wrapping up because this is a meaty topic and there's a lot to talk about. The good news is that you'll have some space to do that on Monday. And one of the issues raised is actually staff have started to address in the AIS that you receive for Monday, and I'll just point you to this matrix that PDD staff created, which outlines all of the places and policies in the city that are actually addressing housing in some way. And so I'll just remind you that that was included in your council packet this week, and it's in front of you again today. And then just looking back at this and thinking about what each of the groups said, I think there's a lot of overlap, and that clearly the evidence will be that we have more affordable housing in our community, and that housing is actually meeting the needs of the community. So that would be strong evidence that our policies are moving in the right direction. In regard to this piece that one group brought up around eWeb and wanting to look at their policies and programs related to housing, are the work that's being done in the CAP in relation to the climate recovery ordinance will actually address that. You might recall that we're going to be working with large lever partners, and eWeb is one of our large lever partners, and we'll be having that exact conversation with them as we look to update the CAP. Types of housing is important, and that came up both in general and then around this idea of missing middle housing. And again, that's something that you'll have the space to discuss on Monday. You'll get a staff update on that. And then thinking about how we compare to other communities was sort of a recurring theme, because we want to be competitive and give folks a place to live. If they work here, we also want them to have a place to live here. Code was another theme, so making sure that our code aligns in a way that's supporting what the community desires. And I'd say those were kind of the overlapping themes just off the top of our head. Again, we'll be looking at all of this again and coming back to you with some information about how this all sort of came together, and we'll probably use the conversation on Monday too. Anything anyone wants to add around this topic?
I would just add that I think several of the groups all talked about partnerships, about expanding partnerships, about public-private partnerships, about working with our local partnerships, about working with the states. I think that's a key piece.
Counselor
I
Taylor?
didn't mention it in my group, but I think the really important thing is inclusionary zoning for housing. It is supposedly on our list of things we're going to discuss as council sometime.
Okay.
I would also underscore our partnerships with the state, because as the federal government continues to divest from housing programs, and our ability to create affordable housing is dramatically impacted by that disinvestment. And so we're going to have to work hand in glove with our state partners to create other investment opportunities and supports for affordable housing at the state level, because we just don't have that capacity at the local level to do that.
Okay. The really good news is that we're on track to make sure you get out of here on time. And we have one more topic to cover in your small group discussions, and that is homelessness. I'm going to refer to the table to see where you're all headed for this last group discussion. So is everyone okay with skipping the break right at this moment? I think that will help us. I see head nods. Okay. All right. So with that, I'll let you know where you're headed next. So for the topic of homelessness, Councilors Semple, Pryor, and Surratt will meet with Catherine and Sarah as your facilitators. Zelinka, Ye, and Evans will meet with Sue, Christy, and Joe as your facilitators. And Councilors Taylor and Clark with Denny and Renee, and Mayor Binnis with Denny and Renee. So we'll take 30 minutes to have a small group discussion about outcomes you'd like to achieve related to homelessness. report outs. And
John's being disruptive.
are you taking a selfie?
Oh,
It's a cat video, I'm sure.
An important cat video.
sorry.
Would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
So, Josu and I met with Councilor Evans, Councilor Yang, Councilor Zelenka in our group. And the group began a little bit about telling the story and how complicated that is. And that, the Addressing Homelessness document that was produced by Reagan, what a valuable tool that is to really help people understand the comprehensive approaches being taken by council to address homelessness. Awesome. Okay. So then there was some discussion around that. There's some feeling. What we hear is that people you say that we're not doing enough or that we're not doing anything. And sometimes people's first individual impact around homelessness or people that are, kind of exposed to new issues that we have as a community go to the assumption that we're not doing anything, which is sometimes obviously not accurate. And so how do we change that everybody's understanding of what's moving forward? And then that this is a broader West Coast problems, and the solutions should be regional and interjurisdictional, and figure out how to relay the complexity of the problem and how we work, with the funding and with our partners. And then the other piece to that was how the system works and who is responsible for what, so that people have a better understanding of what Lane County's responsibility is and what our responsibility is and how we work with nonprofits. So we also talked about metrics a little bit. What is the available bed space for extreme circumstances? And so the Egan Warming Center, and that we're actually doing a really good job of hitting those targets. And then the homeless point and time count and alignment with housing. How does what we learn from that inform the housing need that we have? And then support for the Housing First model. Then you can help people with their individual stabilization to get them into more secure long-term housing strategies. Partnerships was another big theme. Funding, state and Lane County, basically making sure that we're leveraging the funds that are available and use the funds in the most effective way possible. Scope and complexity of the partnerships. Address the lack of mental health facilities, especially as they relate to housing. And that we have a strong nonprofit model in this area and how they support the community needs, and what are the other partners doing. That was kind of a continued theme, is like really taking having an inventory of what everybody is doing to help work together to solve the issues. And then we had a kind of a catch-all category. Let me sit down here. But a catch-all category that talked a little bit about what some other areas are doing. So New York City and some other large cities are taking an approach with their school systems to have affordable housing for the people that work within the school system, so the teachers, and so schools with housing on site for teachers. And that was kind of an approach that they were taking, which is pretty interesting. And then some communities also in California are taking Palo Alto, I think, was the example that it's really expensive to live where they work. And so there's some affordable housing for first responders. Some worry that maybe if your first responders can afford to live in the area that they serve, that you may have a crisis and not be able to respond to that. And then there was a comment about Hawaii, how they've defined homelessness as a public health issue, and are really approaching it in a different way to address that. And let's see, the rest stops, diverse geographically, develop rules, regulations for siting of rest stops. And it's really, the thought, I think, is to use the dispersal policy. I can't read my own writing, for looking at affordable housing models and a better way to
to provide that service. And then incentive for charitable contributions with the tax changes may impact some of our nonprofit agencies and how they're able to sustain their models. And then better and more resources into growing successful and impactful programs. That's a little bit about, also aligns with how we leverage our resources. And then expectations for shelter, that the shelter isn't a silver bullet to solve all the problems that some people might think that it is, and that so just kind of to be aware that we made to think about that in the context of all the solutions and steps that we're taking. And then the lack of available infrastructure locally as compared to places like Portland and what they have available to convert to other types of housing. I'm sure I forgot something, but
one of our success metrics is whether or not we could fill the page.
We didn't get the metric section.
We had room for 2 more.
Failure.
All right. So in Renee and I's group, we had Councilors Taylor, Clark, and the mayor. We had a great discussion. It was very robust, actually, and deep. So in the context of what would progress look like, if we had a shelter or shelters where people have a known, recognizable place to go, people not sleeping on the streets outside. There's a lot of conversation about understanding the issue at a deeper level and begin to talk about it at a deeper level. And I think the theme there really was a lot of times we oversimplify it and we throw everyone in the same homeless category, but it's actually a lot deeper than that. And if we were to move towards really focusing on individuals and helping individuals, because they're across the spectrum, their needs vary a lot from person to person. And the model that I think the mayor mentioned was more of a medical model where we kind of triage individuals into different, more specialized services as we intervene with them. If we were to have determined the appropriate role for the city and work with our partners to fill the gaps, I think the theme there really is we aren't equipped to do everything, so we really need to partner with our solutions, and I think that with our partner out there for some of those solutions, and I think that was a theme in the other group. And that we really work on this as a regional state issue. Homelessness really doesn't have boundaries. It's really something that we're all struggling with. Move folks to places to live. It's not, shelter is important, but it's not just about shelter. I think ultimately the goal is to move them into places to live. Analyze the cost effectivenesses of the various interventions that we're currently using, and rest stops was used as an example. Are we getting the outcomes? Look at those things and really determine, are we getting the outcomes that we want? Are they the right long-term solutions? And can what we're doing now be used to inform what the future long-term action should be? Making sure that we're providing solutions. We're not just enabling and continuing the problem. That was something that we talked about a lot in our group. Help create more capacity amongst the service providers, not just in housing and shelter, but mental health, addiction, and all those other things that are really important. I think this was in Christy's group too. We moved towards implementing strategies that really are aimed at stabilizing the living conditions for individuals. And that we commit ourselves to a more thoughtful, patient approach. It's not a quick fix. It takes time to change the course for an individuals, and if we really need to commit to taking that time and not just look at quick fixes. Get more clear about how to best apply the limited resources that we have to do this work. And I think there was a very similar theme to, again, what Christy's group had talked about is redefining this issue as a wellness issue is the term we used, which is in line, I think, with the health. And really starting to look at this as a community wellness issue, because it's not just about a roof over their head. And to better understand the data, the demographics, the geography of this issue, because that will help better inform the solutions as we go forward. So I know we talked about a lot more than that, so.
That's pretty good.
It was. I want to jump in there, though, too, just because I saw what Mia wrote. Solutions versus enabling. My point with using that word multiple times in different places was to say, to do more of a deep dive on what behaviors and policies on the city's behalf are enabling people to remain homeless. So in other words, in the wellness model, it's great for us to focus, and we should, on helping everyone who wants to get well, to help them. But we should stop enabling people who don't want to get well, was my point.
Catherine and I were with Councilors Simple, Pryor, and Cyrette, and I would say we've had a lot of the same conversations. So I'm not going to, even down to the detail of, we talked about the same medical analogy of like a cardiac unit and whatever, that we really need to have a narrative and be really clear, so when we're linking the strategies to the problem, it's people know what we're doing. So I'm not going to repeat all that. So what I will say is we did go into maybe in a little bit of a different way. We went into some lighter, quicker, cheaper strategies, very specific, that was related to really just visibly getting people off the streets and lowering our homeless count. So some of those were focused around a day center, making sure, maybe not in the core, but closer to the core, we have a day center where people can connect with each other, do basic like laundry stuff, and store their things. We talked about having someplace like a dusk to dawn in downtown, and specifically we discussed parking garages, and wouldn't there be a way we could do something like that to get people out of the sidewalks and doorways of downtown. Talked about needing someplace for youth to go, either expanding on what's already in downtown or having someplace like that. So we're increasing their educational, vocational life skills. We could be doing this in a partnership. But saw a lot of value in that. Saw a lot of value in a day work program, that these are all things we could be supporting, that even if people are getting 4 hours of work. And it was really kind of that bigger picture of a bed for every head, that we're really creating low barrier ways for people to get out and be able to sleep. It was kind of eat, sleep, and be valued, that a place to do that legally. And all the things that you guys said times 2 or 3. Does that seem fair? Something specific you want to add?
Yeah, one thing I would add is also a real attention to the chronically homeless population, because to use Mike's model, there's those people that want help, those people that don't want help, and then within the chronic population, you have those folks who, because of their diminished capacity, don't know whether they can even get help or want help. So if you're looking at the chronic population, there's a huge need there that we need to come up with ways to service.
Add a few things. The day center suggestion was because we already have a day center out on Highway 99, but a day center that's closer to the downtown core, not necessarily in the downtown core. And then I just want to expand, because one of the other groups mentioned this in a similar way, that we think there needs to be a deeper understanding by both council and the public on the strategies needed to address the various individual ways in which people need help. So you kind of talked about it. We tend to clump everyone into one category when in fact the solutions need to speak to individual needs. And then thinking about our partnerships, I was advocating for continuing and strengthening our funding and partnership with the Human Services Commission, but at the same time, scrutinizing and seeing if there's places that we should be addressing issues through social services that we contract with as a city. So if there's an acute need that we need to deal with, that isn't necessarily appropriate or practical to try to do through the HSC.
Okay. Anything we missed on this topic?
I'm assuming we're going to capture all of our notes and they'll be a broader than just this.
Yeah, so did you want to add something?
I wanted to underscore one of the things is about telling our story. This thing that Reagan put together, I read it like the fourth time, and every time I read it, I'm more impressed with it, also impressed with the breadth of it that we're doing. I just counted, there's 36 things on this list. And yet we have people coming up to me all the time and saying, we're not doing anything on homelessness. So we don't tell our story. And then another part of that is this whole notion of, are we spending our limited resources in the right way? I mean, this is very scattered, and it's this over buckshot approach. I mean, the far extreme is we could build a shelter for 100 people and take all of this money and because that's what it would cost to do that, and have one shelter. So it's kind of the two extremes of it. And is our strategy the right, most effective strategy? And then the third thing I wanted to mention is that the way that the new federal tax plan is set up, there's a big disincentive to do charitable donations with the increase in the personal exemption. And we need to be thinking about that, because I think it's going to have a big impact on our charitable organizations. And the way that we do social services in our state is through nonprofits. A lot of places, all these programs we have are government programs. We're doing it through nonprofits. If their funding drops, we're going to be in trouble in being able to provide this services to homelessness and other issues that we have. We need to get out in front of that.
I wanted to add that we didn't actually bring up, but I've heard mentioned before, an effort to keep people from becoming homeless that are in that situational, you broke your leg, you can't get to work, your car died, you lost your child care, and you have a house, but you can't pay next month's rent while you recoup your ability to survive. What if we had a loan program that would be short-term and very low interest to hopefully keep people in their house? So just something to think about.
Okay. So really quickly, because we're up against the 12:30 time here. I think there was definite overlap between the groups in how we both think about and talk about homelessness, and developing a deeper understanding of the various folks that are homeless, and recognizing that there are various populations that are unhoused and they have different needs, and needing to look more closely at the needs of the folks that are homeless in our community. Obviously, some outcomes would be reducing the number of homeless people in our community. Leveraging partnerships was a continued theme. I think even your last point, Councilor Zelinka, about the impacts of federal changes on our local community point to the fact that we need to think about our partnerships as we continue to work on this. Mental health was, of course, a theme. This idea of medical model and thinking about this as a public health concern is a continued theme, and needing to make those connections for the community too are important. I heard a piece about linking our strategies to the problem clearly, because a lot of times we're doing things, if we think about the public safety, what we're addressing through public safety measures actually links to homelessness, but not everybody makes that connection. A day center and downtown needs was a theme. And I think I'll leave it at that. Okay. So, to be respectful of your time, I think rather than doing a round table in closing, I'll ask the city manager to talk a little bit about next steps, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
Well, the execs can do it after.
Not a song from Sarah.
Right.
Learning. Emily, I appreciated your last comment actually quite a bit, because I think when we talk about sort of that Alice data from United Way, a big piece of that is exactly what you talked about, that there's a significant strata of people that are could be moments away from going on the street or going down that road. So I actually think that's a huge challenge that intersects many of these things. I think for us, what we would plan to do is take all of these notes, not just this, but what have been taken at the table, try to put them in some sense of a product that we would schedule a work session after your break. I'll probably try to take at least 90 minutes of a work session, bring that back, and to have you then sort of say, yes, that's what we're wanting to think about when we talk about this particular topic. And, having listened for this morning, others might have a good idea on how all these sort of fit into a framework or into some sort of a narrative, and I don't have that yet, so hopefully others.
It's a cluster.
Yeah, but we're gonna cluster.
You know what word goes with cluster?
I'm just going to sit here silently and shake my head.
I knew it somewhere. So that's what I think we would do as the next steps, is take all this, work with the mayor on scheduling the work session, and come back and try to sort of land something to all of that, if that works.
And then just related to that, we heard you clearly. And again, our intention with creating this table was not to in any way make any one of these more important than the other, rather highlight those today that we needed some more information about. And so we will come back to you with all of these pieces, recognizing that they are all things that you want to think about over the next 12 to 18 months. And with that, I think we're done for the day. So thank you very much. We appreciate your Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank staff for orchestrating this and making it a really productive and worthwhile and engaging morning and well fed. So thank you for all of that.
Thanks, you guys.